Thank you, Cyril. Thank you, John. It's a real privilege to be here and to have the opportunity to discuss with you some of our thoughts about whole grain. These are my disclosure. I'm employed by the Federico II University of Naples, which is publicly funded. I have some research grants from different sources. I'm a member of the advisory board of Nutrition Foundation of Italy, Barilla Foundation for Food and Nutrition, and I've received speaking fee from AstraZeneca, Sanofi, Lilly, BSMS, and Takeda. One of the major topics of this meeting has been the possibility to define the quality of carbohydrate food, to define which carbohydrate food we should advise to the general population. I think this is a very relevant topic because you are all aware that carbohydrate food are indeed under attack. Many people in the press, but also people which belong to the scientific community are questioning carbohydrate food as a relevant source of energy in our diet. Many people blame carbohydrate food as responsible for the epidemics of obesity that we are facing all over the world, even the risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. So it is important that we are able to answer to this attack, not by trying to counterbalance the effect of carbohydrate with that of other foods like fat or proteins, but rather looking into the carbohydrate food and trying to envisage what are the features of carbohydrate food which make them being particularly apt to be advised to the general population or to be utilized with more caution and in moderation in some other cases. Certainly, whole grain may represent one of these features that we have to consider. Why I'm saying so? Well, if you look what we get when we utilize refined wheat for making bread or other cereal products, it's really a shame that, in fact, we are discarding the most part of the kernel. And I would say the part of the kernel which is the richest part in terms of macronutrients, vitamins, minerals, fiber, but even proteins and fat. And we are talking about the so-called good fats because these, in fact, are unsaturated fat which are present in the gel. But we utilize refined food, and therefore we are losing all these potential benefits. So following up what Janet Brand-Miller was saying in relation to the glycemic index, if you look at what you get when you are able to combine refined starch with all the other components of the kernel, this is certainly a way to consider whole grain is a marker of good quality of carbohydrate. But at present, I think that the real challenge we have in front of us is the relationship of diet with cardiometabolic risk, and more in general with non-communicable disease, which are the real challenge that we have to face at the level of the population. And therefore, I will try to review with you some of the evidence which shows that indeed whole grain intake is associated with the reduced cardiometabolic risk. I will review some observational studies, some intervention trial, and also evaluate some potential mechanism. Now, if you look at the evidence coming from observational study, it is really overwhelming. There is no contradiction at all. While you can have contradiction in epidemiological study in relation to the amount of total fat or saturated fat, cardiovascular disease or diabetes, you don't see any inconsistency in the studies available in the literature looking at the relationship between whole grain intake and the risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. You see, they are all in the same direction. All the studies show reduced risk in people who are consuming at least 1 serving of whole grain cereals per day. And this is true for type 2 diabetes risk and cardiovascular disease risk. Actually, if you look, for instance, at the available evidence relating vegetable and fruit consumption in relation to the risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, the data available from observational studies are much weaker than those related to whole grain cereal, although they also seem to show a protective effect of fruit and vegetable consumption and a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. This relationship between whole grain and reduced risk of disease is also shown when you look at obesity. And actually, protective effect of whole grain cereals against obesity and overweight could be one of the possible mechanisms explaining why they have this protective effect, particularly in relation to type 2 diabetes, because we know that overweight is a major risk factor for diabetes. And in fact, if you see this study, this is the nurses' health study, you see that looking at quintiles of whole grain consumption, there is a clear inverse relationship with the risk to become obese with a BMI over 13. These are data from Simin Liu. He is probably here in the audience, so he can better than me describe this study. And what is interesting is first that there is a clear dose response relationship. The higher is the intake of dietary fiber coming particularly from whole grain, specifically whole grain consumption, and the lower the risk to become overweight. The second interesting aspect of this study is that it shows that this relationship applies only to whole grain cereals. It's not something which relates to the whole category of cereals. And in fact, if you look at the refined grain, the relationship goes exactly in the opposite direction. Increasing the consumption of refined grain actually increases the risk to become obese. So whole grain in this study is associated with a reduced risk to become obese, which is specific for whole grain foods. Whole grain has also been found to be associated with improved insulin sensitivity. This is another study, the insulin resistance atherosclerosis study, and it shows that whole grain is associated with improved insulin sensitivity. If you correct whole grain consumption for a number of possible parameters, then this association is going to reduce its significance, but it is still present even if you adjust for BMI and waist circumference. So it seems to suggest that this improvement of insulin sensitivity is partly mediated by overweight and waist reduction, but it has also to do specifically to whole grain consumption, independent of the effect on whole grain, on obesity and overweight. The significance disappears only when the model adjusts for the amount of dietary fiber which is present in whole grain food. Now, while the evidence is very strong in relation to the observational study, what the evidence that we can get from intervention studies is not so strong. There are different ways to try to interpret this. Obviously, to say that that whole grain is associated with a reduced risk does not mean that whole grain is the cause of this reduced risk. So there may be confounder, and we have to take that into account. But it's also possible that, I mean, it's not easy to study the impact of whole grain on many of these risk factors or even disease outcome. First of all, because whole grain come from different sources. Whole grain wheat is different from whole grain barley or whole grain oat, and this is one of the confounding factors. But also, it is possible that some of the effect of whole grain you can observe only on very long-term studies, and unfortunately, mostly due to the difficulty to get funds. We try in nutrition to make short-term studies, and then we get difficulties to find results. But we can go on this aspect in the discussion. I'm showing you some of the data which are available from intervention study. For instance, it's quite clear that whole grain can reduce LDL cholesterol levels, but this applies particularly to oats and barley. The data are less consistent when you are considering wheat. There are data showing that in intervention study, with whole grain, you can improve, you can reduce C-reactive protein as a marker of subclinical inflammation. There are data, we have made a review with Rosalba Giacco about the impact of whole grain on body weight. And as also Wim Saris was mentioning this morning, there are many studies suggesting that by utilizing whole grain, you can reduce body weight. But what is very difficult to ascertain is whether whole grain is able to have any influence on glucose metabolism. That's the reason why we have undertaken this study, which has been funded by the European Community. This is a study that we have performed together with the University of Kuopio. And so we have to share the merit of the study with our friends and colleagues from Kuopio, and particularly Annu Mikkanen, who was the principal investigator together with us. What we did in this study, we took people at high risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. They had some features of the metabolic syndrome, overweight plus at least one other feature of the metabolic syndrome. And we advised these people to follow a diet for 12 weeks. The diet was controlled in terms of nutrients, and the two groups were following exactly the same diet. There was no difference, as I will show you. The difference was that one group was utilizing mainly refined cereal foods. The other group was utilizing mainly whole grain cereal foods. The two groups in Naples and in Kuopio have a slightly different utilization of the products, because in Naples it was 90% wheat, while in Kuopio there was more rye. But the difference was in both centers very clear. In one case there was refined, in the other case it was whole grain. And you can see here we evaluated every month by a 7 days food record the diet they were following, and you see clearly that there is no difference, no major difference between the two groups in the diet they were following. There is a slightly higher intake of protein, because as we said, in whole grain there is also in the external part of the grain there is some more protein, and so in the germ, and some more polyunsaturated fat, but the difference is trivial, although it is statistically significant. What is really important is the difference in total fiber, which is completely due to cereal fiber intake. So there was no change in the amount of fiber coming from fruit and vegetable. The only source of fiber in this study which was changed was cereal fiber. Now, what are the effects of this diet, which was very rich in whole grain as compared with the refined cereal diet? On peripheral insulin sensitivity, no significant effect. On another marker of insulin sensitivity, TWICI, which refers particularly to the fasting state, no significant effect. This S value is derived from the intravenous glucose tolerance test, which is a very reliable way to evaluate peripheral insulin sensitivity, and this was not different. Disposition index, no different, and also insulin secretion was not different. So one could think that these results are in a way disappointing. Yes, they are in a way disappointing, but they are also interesting, because we had the opportunity to study in this context also a test meal, to evaluate at the end of a test meal in both groups, the glucose and insulin response together with other parameters. And as you can see, in the control group, glucose does not change between baseline and the 3 months intervention in the control group and the whole grain group. So the whole grain does not modify postprandial glucose response. However, if you look at the insulin value, you see that the insulin value do not change after the meal in the control group, while they are significantly reduced in the whole grain group. So this suggests that there is an improvement of insulin sensitivity, but not at the peripheral level, but particularly in the splanchnic region and particularly in the postprandial period. And this is not linked with any effect on postprandial glucose. So the two phenomena seems to be separate. We looked also at postprandial triglyceride, and once again, no effect in the control group, while significant reduction in the whole grain group. Which are the possible mechanisms? Well, dietary fiber could be one, but we should consider that dietary fiber have to be evaluated for their effect on glucose metabolism, not only for the impact of dietary fiber on the transit time in the first part of the intestine, glucose emptying, or the effect of dietary fiber in regulating the glucose absorption in the duodenum. But dietary fiber can also play a role in the colon, and we have this morning a very interesting discussion about resistant starch, which only plays its role in regulating glucose metabolism by its ability to be fermented in the colon. So colonic fermentation, bacteria, and also production of short-chain fatty acids certainly play a relevant role in the regulation of glucose metabolism, and particularly the short-chain fatty acids, because they act at the liver level, modulating the production of lipids and also the production of glucose and gluconeogenesis. As a matter of fact, in our study, we were able to find a clear relationship between the change in cereal fiber intake before the study and at the end of the study, and this change in cereal fiber intake in the two groups was correlated with fasting propionate levels. Propionate is one of these short-chain fatty acids which can act at the liver level, modulating glucose and insulin metabolism. And in fact, if you divide our population in those with higher or lower fasting propionate levels, you see that the insulin response is quite different. If you take the median of the fasting propionate level as the cutting point, you see that people with high fasting propionate level have a reduction of insulin levels compared with the baseline, while people with low propionate level have an increase in plasma insulin, and plasma insulin levels in the postprandial period are a marker of insulin resistance. So in these people with high propionate level, you can postulate that there is an improvement of insulin sensitivity. So we need now to give a broader view of what is going to influence glucose and lipid metabolism in the gut. We should not concentrate only in the first part of the intestine, looking at gastric emptying and glucose absorption. This is a very important aspect of carbohydrate digestion. I'm not dismissing the importance of this part of the carbohydrate digestion and the impact on glucose regulation. In fact, this is mainly to act modulating postprandial glucose values. However, dietary fiber, which are not digested in the small intestine, they are reaching the colon, and at this level, they also play an important role, particularly dietary fiber, which can be fermented, because this fermentation is able to influence gut microbiota, to increase short-chain fatty acid, to reduce subclinical inflammation. And this is also acting at the level of satiety, at the level of regulating glucose, and particularly insulin metabolism and body fat. I'm just touching another aspect which should be considered, the phenolic compound. we know that these are becoming more and more popular. I've finished. And these phenolic compounds are present in many vegetable food. And in particularly, we know that phenolic compounds, particularly ferulic acids, are present in the aleurone part of the cereals. And we have recently published a paper, Dr. Rivellese, here present, was the principal investigator, in which we have evaluated the impact of foods rich in polyphenols, natural foods, including fruit, vegetables, and so on, and to evaluate their impact on glucose tolerance and mechanism regulating glucose in the postprandial period. And as you can see, this study was also considering omega-3 fatty acids, but if you concentrate on the two groups in which there was an increased consumption of polyphenols, there is an improvement of glucose tolerance. In this case, was evaluated with an oral glucose tolerance test. The two curves with the triangles are for the subject consuming polyphenols. And if you look at the mechanism of this improvement, you see that this diet rich in polyphenols was able to increase the early insulin secretion in the first 30 minutes of the oral glucose tolerance test, but also to increase insulin sensitivity. In this case, it was evaluated by the OGIS. So my take-home message would be that all grain consumption is associated with a lower risk of major chronic disease, that these foods improve postprandial insulin sensitivity independently of any direct effect on postprandial glycemia. Dietary fiber present in all grain may influence microbiota in the colon and short-chain fatty acid production, and this is one of the mechanisms regulating glucose and lipid metabolism. And also another constituent of all grain, dietary polyphenolic compounds. These are also important in regulating glucose tolerance and in reducing the oxidative stress, which plays a relevant role in cardiovascular disease. So my conclusion would be, is bulk grain a marker of carbohydrate quality? Yes, I would say it is a good marker. I want to finish by acknowledging the contribution of my colleague and friends, San Maria, Angela Rivellese, Giacomo, and Claudia Vetrani. And this is the group at work. We spend most of our time at the table because we want to be personally responsible for the diet that we are advising to our patients. And thank you very much for your attention.